Hello, everyone. My name is Mao Emis. I'm the Executive Director of the African Center for Green Economy. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you the outcomes of COP30 that was recently concluded. So, we're going to be taking you through this, a thoughtful, reflective, and analytical unpacking of what happened at COP30 in Belém, what delegates were expecting, and what was actually delivered, what remains unresolved, and what all of this means for Africa at this critical moment in our transition journey. COP30 was not just another climate finance conference. It came at a time when climate impacts are intensifying dramatically, when climate politics are increasingly polarized, and when many developing countries, including those in Africa, are under extreme fiscal pressure. This COP was also hosted in the Amazon rainforest itself, a climate system on the brink, and that symbolism alone raised expectations. The world entered COP30 with a genuine sense that a decisive action was overdue. What we saw over the 2 weeks in Belém was a mix of ambition, resistance, symbolism, and sometimes chaos, including protests, venue disruption, and even a fire outbreak. So today I want to walk you through all of this and what it actually means for Africa. Before before we delve further, maybe we need to look at. It's important to understand under what circumstances COP30 took place. We do acknowledge that climate impacts are accelerating exponentially. For the first time in COP history, there was a global coalition, including vulnerable nations, civil society, and youth movements, all calling for a clear, time bound phase out of fossil fuels. Many expected COP30 to enshrine a phase out rather than a phase down commitment, a timeline aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius, restrictions on new oil, gas, and coal investments. This did not materialize, however. The second expectation was that there will be major new climate finance commitments. Developing countries expected a new quantified climate finance goal, substantial resources for adaptation, clear mechanisms for loss and damage finance, greater grant based funding, and obviously ease of access to barriers to accessing climate finance, because we do know that the last since the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement, the Green Climate Fund has already delivered the $100 billion a year that was expected. So there was a very high expectation in terms of what climate finance would deliver, to be very ambitious in that regard. That did not however, materialize. The third expectation is around operationalizing the loss and damage fund. At COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, the world agreed on setting up a special fund called the Loss and Damage Fund that was to cater for the impact of climate change that many regions are already experiencing. And at COP28, this fund was operationalized. So at COP30, there was a high expectation that there will be announcements regarding major pledges to this fund. Obviously, it's one thing to operationalize it, but it's something else to capitalize such a fund. Clarify on what the disbursement rules will be, guide country access. Again, issue around access is a very important challenge that many countries are still grappling with. And obviously build institutional capacity to ensure that many countries that traditionally don't have access to these resources would be able to access them. So that's a very important expectation. In terms of the just transition frameworks, there was expectation that obviously there would be an agreed onto global mechanisms for coordinating just transition. And not only that, but there was expectation that there would be some level of guidance on worker protection, funding economic diversification, and support for local government capacity to ensure that delivery happens. Because we do know that as countries transition, the workers will be most impacted. And in Africa, where many countries are still very highly dependent on coal, there was need for clarity in terms of what this transition would entail and how that was going to be achieved. From a governance perspective, from a governance perspective, fossil fuel phase out was supposed to be a very important issue that needed to be dealt with, but unfortunately that didn't also happen. Africa holds majority of the global critical minerals, for example, um, and the governance of these critical minerals is absolutely critical. There was expectation that COP30 would promote beneficiation and local processing, because we do know that Africa, for the longest time, has depended to a large extent on export of raw materials, and that has really significantly impacted industrialization on the continent, but even more importantly, beneficiation of those countries that rely so much on these mineral resources. So there was expectation around how beneficiation of to promote local beneficiation would be achieved through things like local processing, ensure transparency, because we do know that in these critical minerals there's lack of transparency, corruption, and so on, which to a large extent has impeded mechanisms for how these critical minerals could become beneficial to the continent. But even more importantly, to link mineral governance to just transition, because ultimately, if you're going to be transitioning, we need to ensure that those minerals that are regarded as critical, that the world requires for energy and so on, there's a clear linkage to those type of issues. Unfortunately, at COP30, the issue around critical minerals did not receive that priority as was expected. The sixth expectation was around NDC. So this was the last COP where countries were expected to submit their nationally determined contributions. And there was expectation that there would be higher mitigation ambitions, stronger adaptation commitments, and clear national just transition plans. Many countries have already submitted their NDCs, but a lot of it was lacking in detail, and oftentimes it was not very clear, and a lot of ambiguity and lack of ambition. And so it was expected that this COP would help to deliver that. So those are some of the expectations that were people were looking forward to at COP1. A new climate finance promises. There was operationalizing the loss and damage fund, stronger just transition frameworks, effective governance of critical minerals, and more ambitious NDCs. Because ultimately, based on the Paris Climate Agreement, NDCs are the mechanisms through which countries would undertake climate action. But we also do know that many of these NDCs lacked ambition and therefore were not practical to implement, and thus, not enabling countries to undertake accelerated climate action, knowing very well that we are at such a critical time when climate action needs to be undertaken. Having said that, so those were the expectations. Now let's look at what did COP actually achieve. What are some of the actual outcomes that emanated out of COP? I think from a climate finance front, for years, activists, developing countries and so on have been pushing very hard for climate adaptation to be prioritized, but even more importantly, for climate finance, adaptation finance to be unlocked. And one of the key outcomes out of this COP30 was that for the first time, countries agreed to triple adaptation finance by 2035. Even though this is not a binding agreement, this was one of the strongest signals that adaptation is no longer neglected like it was before. It's becoming more central to global climate politics, which is very important, especially for Africa, where adaptation needs are extremely high. So that. I think that was a very good outcome out of this COP. The second outcome is that global adaptation indicators were also agreed on. About 59 global indicators to track adaptation progress. This is a major step for accountability and allows for effective measurement, improved reporting, clearer monitoring, and cross-country comparison. Adaptation has historically lacked metrics. This ends that, even though there was quite a lot of debates around the nature of the matrix, whether it's for climate, adaptation finance, early warning systems and the like. It was very contested space, but I think that by COP 32, hopefully, we would be able to have clarity in terms of how do we actually track this adaptation and how do we implement those metrics in real time. Also, I said earlier on that there was an expectation that the loss and damage fund would be capitalized, even though not much progress was made in terms of countries making pledges. COP30 strengthened the Warsaw International Mechanism, which enabled expanded technical assistance and enhanced reporting frameworks for the loss and damage fund. And also it enabled better coordination between donors and vulnerable nations. But obviously the most limiting aspect is that there was no quantified amounts that were dedicated to the loss and damage fund, which I think for me was a major setback in terms of implementation, considering that this COP was dubbed as the COP of implementation. On the just transition front, COP recognized that transition must include skills and workforce development, and affected workers must be supported. And that also includes local economic diversification, equity, and inclusion. One of the biggest debates around COP this year was around the idea of setting up a global mechanism to coordinate just transition. Unfortunately, that was not really agreed on at COP, but I think having the text around just transition principles is one step closer to getting into a space where we can have a unified global, hopefully, mechanism to coordinate just transition, because ultimately that's really the world requires that. I would say that African leaders delivered very forceful interventions this year. I was very impressed by the statements that African leaders, ranging from ministers, activists, and so on, that they pushed at COP30, and they ranged on a whole lot of issues, from fair finance to local value creation, technology access and transfer, and more importantly, that there's a clear call for a shift from extractive dependency to green industrialization. We do acknowledge that the continent needs to transition, but the dependency on the extractive industry alone is creating a lot of vulnerabilities that would need to be fixed. And one way of doing that is through cleaner production, green industrialization, localization of these very important value chains, so that they can ultimately benefit the continent. And this would help to position Africa very well in terms of a long-term transition agenda in this space. So having said that, what did COP deliver? I think that we will all agree that obviously there was a partial achievement from this process. Many activists felt disappointed that a lot of people went into COP with high level of optimism, that this COP would deliver, and there was a lot of talk that this was going to be an implementation COP and so on. But if you look at the fact that the quantified goal on climate finance was not achieved, just transition coordination mechanisms were not clearly defined, even though some indicators were developed for adaptation, not much progress was made there. So I would say the outcomes were tapered. They were not as one would have expected. And in terms of what COP did not achieve, I think one of the biggest failures, obviously, is that no fossil fuel phase out was achieved. The final text avoided an explicit commitment. This is arguably one of the largest failures of COP30. There were a lot of lobbyists there, obviously, but I think that if you look at the fact that this year we're closer to, exceeded the expected warming, the idea that fossil fuel, that the world cannot, agree on a fossil fuel phase out is quite disappointing. And we hope that, that can be, that issue can be raised in subsequent COPs to ensure that that does not happen again. There was no binding finance commitment again, even though countries agreed to triple adaptation finance, but this is not guaranteed. We've seen it from the Paris Climate Agreement, where there was commitment that $100 billion would be released every year, but that target was never reached. And when and even the nature of that finance ended up being loans, which created more burden to developing countries. Yet the expectation was that it would be in form of grant-based financing that should help, so that to lessen the debt burden on developing countries. And so I think that in addition to the to no fossil fuel phase out, the fact that there was no binding finance commitments was a big disappointment, considering especially that this was dubbed to be an implementation COP. Without finance, there's no implementation that can happen. Many NDCs, several countries did not update their NDCs, leaving the world far off track for 1.5 degrees Celsius anticipated climate goal of keeping the world under 1.5 degrees Celsius. Without these highly ambitious NDCs, we are on track to exceed that 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, which will be catastrophic for humanity. So yeah, this is quite a big thing, because ultimately, without these NDCs, there's not really much that countries can do in terms of addressing climate change in their respective nations. In the mineral governance still missing. Africa's key demand, which was basically fair and transparent value chains, was largely absent. There was in many negotiating rooms that did not feature, which is quite sad, because we know that Africa holds substantial critical mineral resources, and we need to guard against business as usual, which was to be extractive and ensure that these minerals actually benefit the continent. And that can be done through effective beneficiation mechanisms, local value addition, and so on. And so I'm hoping that African leaders will take this again in subsequent COPs to be able to ensure that the COP text protects these critical minerals, that, and even more importantly, make them beneficial to the continent. In terms of the loss and damage fund, the architecture of the fund improved because of that Warsaw adoption of the Warsaw Declaration. I think that was very useful. But again, finance did not materialize. So there's still significant gaps that remain in terms of the loss and damage fund, and that I think is something that still needs to be revisited. So, I mean, we all had in the news. So those are really some of the key failures of achievements and failures of COP. But this COP was very dramatic. There were quite a bit of happenings. Protesters, for example, breaching the venue. I don't think I've ever been to a COP where indigenous people had so much presence, both inside and outside. I think that for me was a very important signal that we can no longer ignore indigenous communities, especially for a COP that took place in the Amazon, with significant indigenous population, but also facing major threats in terms of deforestation, mining, land grabs, and so on in the Amazon. And so having the voices of indigenous communities, I thought was a very important outcome out of COP. So what do all of this mean for Africa? I think that it's all been said before already. For me, when I go to these conferences and seeing how difficult these negotiation processes are, one thing is very clear is that we on Africa must drive our own transition. This COP showed for me that Africa can no longer wait for global breakthroughs, because as we speak now, we're already experiencing the devastating impact of climate change. So we need to make sure that we take action, and we're not going to rely on the global community to help us navigate this challenging period that we're going through. So I think that the continent needs to take leadership and push its transition to make sure that we can adapt to the impact of climate change. And even more importantly, we need to move more urgently into implementation. Africa must build national adaptation delivery systems, subnational capacity, but even more importantly, locally led adaptation platforms, so that we can go into action, because the time for inaction, I think, is long overdue. Africa is a young continent with a very high number of young people. It's a young continent. We must prioritize green jobs and skills development as being very critical, because ultimately the continent needs to create jobs, need to build resilience against the impact of climate change. And to do that, we have to ultimately prioritize green jobs. And this includes, developing value chains such as renewable energy value chains. We've seen, for example, in South Africa that with more than $60 billion invested in renewable energy in this country, very little beneficiation has taken place, which is very sad, because one would have expected that the renewable energy industry would have been very well developed in South Africa, but it's not the case. We still rely a lot on importations and so on. So localizing these value chains is non-negotiable. It's really the only way for the continent to ensure that its people benefit, but even more importantly, are resilient to this impact of climate change. So looking at renewable energy value chain, circular economy, involving youth innovation ecosystems, and industrial green skills are going to be very, very key. This is going to be really this is essentially the foundation for the just transition. We need to understand those value chains, build the right skills to be able to create those jobs, and ultimately open the pathway for green industrialization. I think that the continent still must push for beneficiation in terms of the critical minerals. We need to look at how do we localize these value chains through innovations in manufacturing, regional, for example, looking at regional manufacturing hubs to build capacity locally, but also for better collaboration between current countries. But we all know that this can't happen without clear transparency and effective governance, which to a large extent has been one of the biggest challenges this continent faces. But for me, even more importantly, is to place communities at the center of this discourse at the center of these opportunities, because ultimately communities are the ones that are most impacted by the impact of climate change and need these opportunities the most. So co-creating with communities, making sure that communities are very central to this discourse around just transition is going to be very important. I think that for us at the African Center for Green Economy, our work, supporting local municipalities through building green job platforms and so on is even going to be more urgently required, since the continent will need to move into a phase where it leads on implementation of climate action and policies that are required to drive the change that is needed. So if I may just, conclude this presentation, I would say that COP30 offered very important signals, but it did not deliver the decisive action and that the science demands. For Africa, the message is very clear. We must move from global dependence to regional agency, from negotiation rooms to communities, from declarations to implementation. The real work begins now, in our cities, in our municipalities, villages, small enterprises, and frontline communities. And this is where our institutions like the African Center for Green Economy and our partners across the continent play a defining role. Thank you for your attention, and I thank you for your continued commitment to building an inclusive, green, and just future for Africa. Please, if you have any perspectives, share our comments, subscribe to our newsletters, and we hope to engage with you as we move towards building a greener and inclusive continent for all. Thank you.